The smell of another woman's perfume hit me before I even saw them wrapped together under my Christmas tree. 28 years of marriage ended in the time it took me to drop my suitcase and watch my husband Richard kiss his secretary like she was his Christmas miracle instead of his midlife crisis. I stood frozen in my own living room doorway, still wearing my travel clothes from visiting my sister in Phoenix, watching the man I'd loved since I was 26 unwrap Holly like she was his personal gift from Santa. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up and tell you how this perfect little Christmas scene came to be. I'd been gone for exactly 5 days, visiting my sister Karen, who'd been going through her own divorce drama. The irony wasn't lost on me now. While I was consoling her about her cheating husband, mine was apparently auditioning for a role in his own romance movie right here at home. I'd texted Richard that my flight was delayed and I wouldn't be home until tomorrow. Apparently, that was all the invitation he needed to turn our living room into his personal love nest. The tree we decorated together just 2 weeks ago now looked like a backdrop for their romantic comedy. The lights I'd spent hours untangling were twinkling down on them as Richard murmured sweet things into Holly's ear. The same ear that usually heard my dictation at the accounting firm where she worked as his secretary. Well, clearly she was taking dictation of a different kind now. "Richard," I said, and my voice sounded surprisingly steady considering my entire world had just imploded. They sprang apart like teenagers caught by their parents. Holly's face went 3 shades of red that perfectly matched our Christmas decorations. She started babbling something about working late and reviewing files, as if I was blind as well as stupid. Richard at least had the decency to look ashamed, though he was trying to arrange his face into what I recognized as his "let me explain" expression. "Margaret, I can explain," he started right on cue. "I'm sure you can," I said, setting my purse down with careful precision. "But I don't think I need to hear about your filing system right now." Holly grabbed her coat and mumbled something about forgetting an important appointment, practically running for the door. Smart girl. If she'd stuck around, I might have explained exactly what I thought of her Christmas spirit. Richard ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit I'd found endearing for nearly 3 decades. Not so much anymore. "Margaret, please sit down. Let's talk about this like adults." "Adults," I repeated, looking at our Christmas tree that had apparently been hosting more than just presents. "Is that what we're calling it?" "It's not what you think. I think it's exactly what I think, Richard. Unless you were performing CPR on Holly under our Christmas tree and she needed mouth-to-mouth for an unusually long time." He actually had the nerve to look annoyed. "Don't be sarcastic, Margaret. This is serious." "Sarcastic?" I laughed, and it sounded hollow even to me. "Richard, I just walked into my own home and found my husband of 28 years playing Santa Claus with his secretary. Sarcasm is pretty much all I've got left right now." "Margaret, How long?" I asked, cutting him off. I didn't really want to know, but I needed to know. 6 months, he said quietly. 6 months. While I'd been working extra hours at the library to help pay for his mother's care home, while I'd been planning our anniversary trip for next spring, while I'd been buying Christmas gifts for his whole family, including a nice bonus gift card for Holly, because Richard said she'd been such a helpful employee this year. Helpful indeed. "I want you to leave," I said. "Margaret, this is my house too. We need to. I want you to leave right now, Richard. Take whatever you need for tonight. We can figure out the rest later. But I can't look at you right now without wanting to redecorate this room with whatever's closest to my hands." He must have seen something in my expression that convinced him I wasn't bluffing, because he nodded and headed upstairs. I heard him moving around, opening drawers, running water, normal sounds that felt completely foreign now. 20 minutes later, he came back downstairs with a suitcase and his sheepish expression back in place. "Margaret, I know this is horrible, but maybe it's a blessing in disguise. We haven't been happy for a while. You know that." I stared at him. "Richard, up until 20 minutes ago, I thought we were fine. I thought we were planning to travel next year when you retire. I thought we were in this together. We just grew apart," he said, like it was something that had happened to us instead of something he'd chosen. "No, Richard, I grew apart. You grew into Holly." He actually winced at that. Good. He should wince. "I'll call you tomorrow. We need to talk about how to handle this practically. The house, finances, all of it. I nodded, mainly because I wanted him out of my sight before I said something I couldn't take back, or threw something I couldn't take back. After he left, I stood in my living room looking at our Christmas tree. 28 years of Christmas mornings, and this was how it ended. With the smell of another woman's perfume still hanging in the air, and Christmas lights twinkling over the spot where my marriage had died, I walked over and unplugged the tree. Then I grabbed my coat and walked out into the December night, leaving everything behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house with the ghost of their romance haunting my Christmas tree. That's when I realized my real Christmas story was just beginning. The cold air hit my face like a wake-up call, which was exactly what I needed. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes, letting my feet choose the direction while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The neighborhood looked different at night. All the Christmas decorations turned into little monuments to happy families I was no longer part of. I found myself downtown without really planning it, walking past the shops that were all closed except for Murphy's Diner, which stayed open late for the Christmas shopping crowd. The streets were mostly empty, except for a few people hurrying to their cars, arms full of shopping bags. Everyone seemed to have somewhere warm to go, someone waiting for them. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman was standing near the steps of St. Mary's Church, wearing a thin sweater that was no match for the December wind. She was looking around with the confused expression of someone who couldn't quite remember where she was supposed to be. No coat, no hat, and she was shivering. My own problems suddenly felt smaller. At least I had somewhere warm to go, eventually. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her carefully. "Are you all right?" She turned to me, and I could see she was probably in her late 70s, with beautiful silver hair that was perfectly styled despite the wind. She had the kind of bone structure that suggested she'd been stunning in her youth, but right now she just looked lost and cold. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice cultured with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I was supposed to meet someone, but I can't remember who or when." She looked down at herself as if surprised by her own clothing. "And I seem to have forgotten my coat. It's freezing out here. How long have you been waiting?" "I don't know," she said, and I could hear the distress creeping into her voice. "I remember being in a warm car, and then nothing until now." I looked around. There were no other people nearby, no car running or waiting. Just this elderly woman standing alone in the cold, clearly confused and possibly in the early stages of hypothermia. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Eleanor," she said immediately, then frowned. "Eleanor Hawthorne. Yes, that's right. Eleanor Hawthorne. Well, Eleanor, I'm Margaret, and I think we need to get you somewhere warm while we figure this out. There's a diner right across the street. Would you like to get some coffee?" She looked at me with relief that made my heart clench. "That would be wonderful. But I don't think I have my purse." "My treat," I said, and meant it. Whatever was happening in my own life could wait. This woman needed help, and helping her felt like the first right thing I'd done all day. I guided her across the street, keeping my arm linked through hers. She moved carefully but steadily, and I noticed her shoes were expensive, the kind of leather flats that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bill. Her sweater, despite being too thin for the weather, looked like cashmere. Someone with money was missing this woman. Murphy's Diner was warm and bright, decorated with tinsel and plastic holly that had probably been there since the Carter administration. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, glanced up as we entered. "2 coffees," I said, guiding Eleanor to a booth near the heater. "And could we get some menus?" Eleanor slid into the booth gratefully, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug when it arrived. "You're very kind," she said, her confusion seeming to lift a little in the warmth. "I don't know what I was doing out there. Do you remember how you got to the church? Did someone drive you?" She closed her eyes, concentrating. "There was a car, a nice car, but I don't remember getting out." She opened her eyes, frustration clear on her face. "This is so embarrassing. I pride myself on being sharp." "Everyone gets confused sometimes," I said, though privately I was wondering if she had dementia or if something else had happened. "Do you live around here?" I think so. Or maybe not. Everything looks familiar and strange at the same time." I pulled out my phone. "Eleanor, is there someone I could call for you? Family?" Her face brightened. "Yes, my son, David. I have his number. She patted her sweater pockets, looking distressed again. But I don't have my phone. Do you remember his number? She rattled off a number with confidence, the first thing she'd been certain about since I'd found her. I dialed and put the phone on speaker so she could hear. It rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, sharp with concern. Who is this? How did you get this number? My name is Margaret Thompson, I said quickly. I found a woman named Eleanor Hawthorne downtown. She says she's your mother? My God, where is she? The relief in his voice was immediate and overwhelming. Is she hurt? I've been looking for her for 2 hours. She walked away from the car when we stopped for gas, and when I came back from paying, she was gone. She's fine, just cold and a little confused. We're at Murphy's Diner on Main Street. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. Please don't let her leave. Thank you. Thank you so much for calling. Eleanor was listening with a smile spreading across her face. That's my David, she said proudly. He always sounds worried, but he's a good boy. Something about the way she said boy made me smile despite everything. This was clearly a woman who would always see her children as children, no matter how old they got. He's on his way, I told her. Should be here in about 10 minutes. Wonderful, she said, then looked at me more closely. Margaret, you've been crying. I touched my face, surprised. I hadn't realized. It's been a difficult evening. Would you like to talk about it? Eleanor asked, her confusion seeming to clear as she focused on someone else's problems. I'm a good listener when I'm myself. I found myself actually considering it, which was insane. I'd just met this woman, and she was clearly dealing with her own issues. But there was something about her presence that felt safe, comforting. My husband is having an affair, I said before I could stop myself. I found them together tonight, in our living room, under our Christmas tree. Eleanor reached across the table and patted my hand with surprising strength. Oh, my dear, that's terrible. What a fool he must be. It was such a simple, straightforward response that I almost laughed. After 2 hours of confusion and shock, having someone just call Richard a fool felt refreshing. 28 years, I said. I thought we were happy. Men are mysterious creatures, Eleanor said, with the authority of someone who had lived long enough to figure a few things out. They can be wonderful, and then they can be complete idiots, sometimes in the same day. His secretary, I added, because somehow it felt important to share the full humiliation. Eleanor tisked disapprovingly. How unoriginal of him. You'd think after 28 years he'd at least be creative in his stupidity. That did make me laugh. A real laugh that surprised me. You know what? You're absolutely right. If he was going to blow up our marriage, he could have at least done it with some style. We were both laughing when the diner door opened and a man rushed in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on our booth. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being in charge. He looked like Eleanor, same cheekbones, same aristocratic nose. He also looked like he'd been through his own kind of hell for the past 2 hours. Mother, he said, reaching our table in 3 quick strides. That's when everything got very interesting. The man who rushed to our table was not what I'd expected. I'd pictured Eleanor's son as someone elderly himself, maybe a tired 60-something dealing with aging parent issues. Instead, David Hawthorne looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine about successful businessmen. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive wool coat that probably cost more than my car payment. He had Eleanor's same blue eyes, but where hers were warm and confused, his were sharp with worry and something that looked like barely controlled frustration. Mother, he said again, sliding into the booth next to Eleanor, and immediately pulling her into a hug that made my chest tight. The relief on his face was so raw it hurt to watch. Thank God you're safe. David, darling, Eleanor said, patting his cheek like he was 5 years old. I'm fine. This lovely woman took care of me. Margaret, this is my son David. David turned to me, and I got the full force of his attention. It was like being evaluated by a very expensive lawyer who was trying to decide if I was worth his time. Margaret Thompson, I said, extending my hand. I found your mother outside St. Mary's Church. She was cold and seemed confused. He shook my hand, and I noticed his was trembling slightly. I can't thank you enough. When I came back from the gas station, and she was gone. He ran his free hand through his hair. She was there 1 second, and then just vanished. I wandered off, Eleanor said cheerfully, as if discussing the weather. I do that sometimes lately, but Margaret rescued me and brought me somewhere warm. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mother, you know you're supposed to stay in the car when I'm paying for gas. Do I? Eleanor asked, genuine confusion returning to her voice. I thought you said I could stretch my legs. I watched this exchange with growing understanding. Eleanor wasn't just having a bad night. This was something ongoing. David's careful patience suggested he'd been dealing with this for a while. It's getting worse, isn't it? I asked quietly. David met my eyes, and for a second his professional composure slipped. Early stage Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed 6 months ago. His voice was carefully controlled. Most days she's completely herself, but when she gets tired or stressed, I'm sitting right here, Eleanor said with dignity, and I can hear you discussing me. You're right, Mother. I apologize. David's tone immediately shifted to something warmer. Are you ready to go home? Not yet, Eleanor said, turning to me with sudden intensity. Margaret was telling me about her husband, the fool who's having an affair with his secretary. David's eyebrows shot up, and he looked at me with an expression that was part surprise and part something I couldn't identify. I'm sorry. That's difficult. It's been an interesting evening, I said, suddenly self-conscious. Here I was, sharing my personal disasters with strangers in a diner. I probably shouldn't have burdened your mother with my problems. Nonsense, Eleanor said firmly. Problems shared are problems halved. That's what my husband used to say. She turned to David. Harold used to say that, didn't he? Yes, Mother. Dad always said that. The way he said Dad made it clear Harold was no longer around. Eleanor had lost her husband, was losing her memories, and now her son was clearly carrying the weight of caring for her alone. Suddenly, my marriage problems felt smaller in comparison. Well, I said, starting to stand, I should let you two get home. It's late, and I'm sure you've had enough excitement for one evening. Wait, David said, and there was something urgent in his voice. Please sit for a minute. I want to... He paused, seeming to struggle with something. I want to properly thank you. What you did tonight, helping my mother, calling me, most people would have just minded their own business. Anyone would have done the same thing, I said. But I sat back down. No, he said firmly. They wouldn't have. I know because this isn't the first time she's wandered off. And you're the first person who's actually helped her instead of just calling the police. Eleanor was listening to this exchange with interest, her confusion seeming to come and go like a radio station fading in and out. Where do you live? David asked. I'd like to drive you home. It's the least I can do. I hesitated. I didn't particularly want to go back to my house, where Richard's betrayal was still hanging in the air like smoke. But I also wasn't sure I wanted to get into a car with a stranger, even one who seemed genuinely grateful. Actually, I said, I think I'll walk. I need the air. In this weather? It's freezing. I like the cold, I lied. Clears my head. Eleanor was studying me with an expression that suggested her confusion had lifted again. Margaret, dear, you don't want to go home, do you? Her directness caught me off guard. No, not particularly. Because of the fool husband? Mother, David said. But he was looking at me with something that might have been understanding. Because of the fool husband, I confirmed. Eleanor nodded decisively. Then you'll come home with us. Mother, that's not... David started. Nonsense, Eleanor said, waving him off. We have 12 bedrooms in that ridiculous house you insisted on buying. Margaret needs somewhere to go tonight, and we owe her a debt. It's settled. David looked like he wanted to argue, but he also looked like he'd learned to pick his battles with his mother. He turned to me with an expression that was carefully polite, but clearly reluctant. You're welcome to stay the night, he said, and I could hear the effort it took to make the invitation sound sincere. Though I'm sure you'd prefer to go to your own home. There was something in his tone that suggested he'd really prefer if I preferred my own home, which, perversely, made me want to accept Eleanor's invitation just to see what would happen. That's very kind, I said, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, Eleanor said firmly. It's Christmas kindness. Harold always said Christmas was about helping people who need help. She was right about one thing. I did need help. I needed somewhere to go that wasn't my house, with its lingering perfume and unplugged Christmas tree. I needed a night to think about what came next, without having to stare at the spot where my marriage had died. And honestly, I was curious about these people. Eleanor with her confusion and warmth, David with his careful control and obvious reluctance to have a stranger in his house. There was clearly more to their story than a simple case of early Alzheimer's. "All right," I said, surprising myself. "Just for tonight. Thank you." David's expression suggested he thought I'd just made a mistake, but Eleanor beamed like I'd given her the best Christmas present ever. "Wonderful," she said, clapping her hands together. "David, call ahead and have Mrs. Morrison prepare the blue guest room. Margaret will need fresh towels and perhaps some of my nightgowns. We look about the same size." David pulled out his phone with the air of someone who was used to managing his mother's impulses. "Mrs. Morrison, we'll be home in about 20 minutes with a guest. Yes, the blue room would be fine. No, nothing urgent, just someone who helped Mother tonight." I listened to him making arrangements with someone who was clearly household staff and began to wonder exactly what I'd gotten myself into. The expensive coat, the multiple bedrooms, the live-in help. The Hawthorns weren't just comfortable, they were wealthy. Seriously wealthy. As we left the diner, David helped Eleanor into the passenger seat of what I now saw was a Mercedes sedan that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. He opened the back door for me with careful politeness. "Thank you," I said as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Thank you," he said, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror, "for helping her, for bringing her inside and keeping her safe." There was something in his voice that suggested this was more than politeness. Whatever was happening with Eleanor's condition, David was living with a level of constant worry I was just beginning to understand. As we drove through the city, Eleanor kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out buildings and telling stories about the old days that seemed to span several different decades. David responded patiently, but I caught him glancing at her with an expression that was part love, part exhaustion, and part something that looked like grief. After about 15 minutes, we turned into a neighborhood I'd driven through, but never actually entered. The houses got progressively larger and farther apart, hidden behind gates and established landscaping. When David turned into a driveway marked by stone pillars, I realized I'd made a significant miscalculation about exactly who these people were. The house at the end of the drive wasn't just large, it was a mansion. 3 stories of fieldstone and timber, with enough windows to light a small town and a circular drive that could accommodate a dozen cars. "Welcome to Hawthorne House," Eleanor said proudly. "Harold built it for me when David was born. I thought it was ridiculously large then, and I still think it's ridiculously large now." David pulled up in front of an entrance that belonged on a magazine cover. "Mother has always preferred smaller spaces," he said dryly, "but she refuses to move." "Where would I go?" Eleanor asked reasonably. "This is where I raised my children, where Harold and I hosted parties, where all my memories live. You can't just pack up memories, David." I sat in the back seat, looking up at this house that belonged to people who lived in a completely different world than mine, and wondered what the hell I was doing here. A few hours ago, I'd been a middle-class librarian dealing with a cheating husband. Now I was about to spend the night in a mansion with people who probably had more money than my entire hometown combined. That's when I realized this might have been exactly what I needed. A night in someone else's world, where my problems couldn't follow me, and everything was too strange to feel real. But as we walked up the steps to a front door that probably cost more than my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover there was much more to the Hawthorne family story than a wealthy son caring for his mother with dementia. Mrs. Morrison turned out to be a small, efficient woman in her 60s who managed to convey both warmth and subtle authority in the time it took to hang up my coat. She greeted Eleanor with the kind of gentle familiarity that comes from years of experience, and treated me with polite curiosity that suggested unexpected house guests weren't entirely unusual. "I've prepared the blue guest room," she told David. "Fresh linens, extra towels, and I put some of Mrs. Hawthorne's nightgowns and a robe in the closet." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," David said, and I caught the subtle relief in his voice. Clearly, having someone competent manage the household details was crucial when your mother might wander off at any moment. "I thought Margaret might like some tea," Eleanor announced, as if she'd just had a brilliant idea. "Mrs. Morrison, could you prepare that lovely chamomile blend, the one Harold always said tasted like Christmas?" Mrs. Morrison's expression softened. Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'll bring it to the sitting room. As Eleanor headed toward what I assumed was the sitting room, David caught my arm gently. I should explain, he said quietly, about the house, about my mother's condition. You're probably wondering what you've gotten yourself into. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted. Mother has good days and bad days. Tonight was actually better than some, probably because helping you gave her something to focus on. But sometimes she doesn't recognize familiar places or people. Sometimes she thinks my father is still alive. I just wanted you to know, in case she gets confused during the night? Exactly. Mrs. Morrison sleeps in the room next to Mother's. But if you hear wandering or voices, don't be alarmed. It's normal. There was something heartbreaking about the way he said normal, as if he'd had to redefine that word to accommodate losing his mother piece by piece. David, I said, then hesitated. It wasn't my business, but something in his careful control reminded me of myself. Always managing, always responsible, always holding things together. When was the last time you took a break? He looked surprised by the question. A break? Time away. Time when you weren't managing her care or worrying about her safety. He paused, and I could see him actually thinking about it. I can't remember. There's too much to manage. Medical appointments, safety concerns, legal issues while she's still competent enough to make decisions. And I travel for work, which means coordinating with Mrs. Morrison and the day nurses. You have day nurses? 3 different ones, rotating shifts when I'm not here. Mother hates it, but she can't be alone anymore. He ran his hand through his hair again, and I was starting to recognize it as a stress response. She was always so independent. This is killing her, losing herself piece by piece. We were interrupted by Eleanor calling from the sitting room. Margaret, come see Harold's portrait. David and I exchanged glances. She wants to show you my father, he said. He died 3 years ago, but sometimes she talks about him like he just stepped out of the room. The sitting room was exactly what you'd expect in a house like this. High ceilings, built-in bookshelves, furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. But it also felt lived in, comfortable. There were family photos everywhere, books stacked on tables, a throw blanket draped over one of the chairs like someone actually used this room. Eleanor was standing in front of a portrait over the fireplace. The man in the painting looked like an older version of David, same strong jaw, same intelligent eyes, but warmer somehow. He was smiling like he just heard something amusing. That's my Harold, Eleanor said proudly. Wasn't he handsome? David looks just like him, you know. Same stubborn chin. He was very handsome, I agreed, and meant it. Harold built this house for me when I was pregnant with David, Eleanor continued, settling into a chair near the fireplace. I told him it was too big, too fancy, but he said he wanted to give me a house where I could raise our children and grandchildren. He was always planning ahead. My Harold. David sat across from his mother, and I noticed how carefully he watched her, as if monitoring for signs of confusion. Grandchildren? I asked, settling into a chair that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Eleanor's face lit up. Oh yes, David's going to give me grandchildren someday. Aren't you, darling? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mother, we've discussed this. Have we? I don't remember. Eleanor turned to me, conspiratorially. He's 52 years old and still not married. Can you believe that? A handsome, successful man like David, and he spends all his time taking care of his old mother instead of finding a wife. Mother, David said, and there was a warning in his voice. It's true, Eleanor said, unperturbed. I tell him all the time. Harold and I were married when we were 23. By the time Harold was David's age, David was already in college. Mrs. Morrison appeared with a tea service that looked like it belonged in a museum. As she served, I caught her exchanging a quick look with David that suggested this was a familiar conversation. Margaret, Eleanor said, accepting her teacup, you're about David's age, aren't you? And you're getting divorced, so you'll be single soon. How convenient. I nearly choked on my tea. Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm not actually divorced yet. As of this evening, I'm just separated, by about 3 hours. Even better, Eleanor said decisively. Fresh start for both of you. David looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Mother, please. What? I'm just saying, it's nice to see David talking to a woman his own age for once. Usually it's just nurses and doctors and that horrible Mrs. Pemberton from the country club who keeps calling here. Mrs. Pemberton calls? I asked, because David's discomfort was becoming entertaining, and frankly, after the evening I'd had, a little entertainment felt good. Every week, Eleanor said with obvious distaste. She brings casseroles and asks about David's availability. She's 68 years old and has been chasing eligible widowers since her husband died 5 years ago. Very persistent. Mother, David said firmly, I think our guest might prefer to rest rather than hear about Mrs. Pemberton's romantic pursuits. Actually, I said, surprising myself, after the day I've had, hearing about someone else's dating disasters is exactly what I need. Eleanor beamed. See? Margaret understands. Now tell me more about this husband of yours. What kind of man has an affair with his secretary? It's so unimaginative. And somehow, sitting in a mansion that belonged in a magazine, drinking tea that probably cost more per cup than I usually spent on groceries, I found myself telling the complete story to a woman with Alzheimer's and her obviously uncomfortable son. So there I was, I said, reaching the end of my tale, standing in my own living room watching my husband unwrap his secretary like she was his personal Christmas present. Eleanor tisked disapprovingly. Under your Christmas tree. How tacky. Extremely tacky, I agreed. What did you say to him? Eleanor asked. I asked if he was performing CPR that required unusually long mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Eleanor burst into delighted laughter. Even David cracked a smile despite himself. Perfect, Eleanor said. Sharp and dignified. That's exactly what I would have said. What would you have said, David? I asked, because something about his reaction suggested this conversation was hitting close to home. I would have said that people who betray trust usually do it because they're too cowardly to have honest conversations about what they really want, he said quietly. There was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't just talking about my situation. Eleanor studied her son's face with the kind of clarity that seemed to come and go unpredictably. David knows about betrayal, she said softly. Don't you, darling? David's expression shuddered immediately. Mother, that's not relevant. Isn't it? Margaret, did I tell you David was engaged once? Mother, please don't. A lovely girl named Catherine. Or was it Caroline, one of those C names? They were together for 3 years, and then she decided she preferred David's business partner. Took half their joint assets and moved to California. I looked at David, who was staring into his teacup like it contained the secrets of the universe. I'm sorry, I said. That must have been difficult. Ancient history, he said, but his voice suggested it wasn't as ancient as he'd like. 5 years isn't ancient, Eleanor said helpfully, and David hasn't dated anyone seriously since. I think he's gun-shy. Mother, I think our guest might be tired. I was tired, but I was also fascinated by this glimpse into David Hawthorne's carefully controlled life. The successful businessman facade was starting to crack, revealing someone who'd been hurt and was still carrying the damage. Actually, Eleanor said, standing up with sudden energy, I just remembered something important. Margaret, what did you do for work before you got married? I'm a librarian, I said. Still am, actually. I work at the city library downtown. Eleanor's face lit up with excitement. David, did you hear that? Margaret's a librarian. David looked puzzled. Yes, Mother, I heard. Don't you see? It's perfect. Eleanor turned to me. David has been looking for someone to help organize his father's papers. Harold was a historian, and there are thousands of documents, photographs, letters. David keeps saying he'll get to it when he has time. But I don't have time, David finished. Mother, I'm sure Margaret has her own job to get back to. Actually, I said slowly, an idea beginning to form, I'm on leave from the library until after New Year's. Personal time. It had been planned as vacation time to spend with Richard, but that obviously wasn't happening now. Eleanor clapped her hands together. See, it's fate. Margaret needs somewhere to stay while she sorts out her divorce. David needs help with Harold's papers, and I need some female company that isn't Mrs. Pemberton bringing casseroles. David was shaking his head. Mother, that's not appropriate. Margaret doesn't need to. How much would you pay someone to do that kind of work? I interrupted. He named a figure that made my eyebrows rise. It was more than I made in 2 months at the library. And it would take, how long? Probably 2 weeks, if someone knew what they were doing. I did quick math in my head. 2 weeks of good pay, somewhere comfortable to stay while I figured out my next steps, and a project that would keep my mind occupied instead of dwelling on Richard's betrayal. I'm interested, I said. David stared at me. You're serious? Completely serious. I need somewhere to stay, I need the money, and I'm good at organizing documents. It sounds like we could help each other. Eleanor was practically bouncing in her chair. Wonderful, it's settled. Margaret will stay here and work on Harold's papers, and I'll have someone interesting to talk to. Mother, David said carefully, don't you think we should discuss this privately first? What's to discuss? Eleanor asked. Margaret helped me tonight when she could have just minded her own business. She's educated, she's kind, and she makes me laugh. Plus, she's not Mrs. Pemberton. I found myself laughing. That's definitely true. I'm not Mrs. Pemberton. David was looking back and forth between us like he'd lost control of the conversation, which he had. But I could see him thinking, weighing the practical benefits against whatever reservations he had about having a stranger in his house. 2 weeks, he said finally. Trial basis. If it's not working out for any of us, no hard feelings. Agreed, I said, extending my hand. He shook it, and his grip was warm and firm. I think this might be the most impulsive decision I've ever made. Good, Eleanor said decisively. You need more impulsive decisions in your life, David. Don't you think so, Margaret? I looked at David Hawthorne. Successful, careful, obviously carrying his own share of old hurts, and then at Eleanor, who was beaming like she'd just orchestrated the best Christmas miracle ever. I think, I said carefully, that sometimes impulsive decisions lead to exactly where you need to be. What I didn't say was that sitting in this beautiful room, planning to spend 2 weeks organizing a dead man's papers, felt like the first step toward a life I couldn't even imagine yet. And for the first time since walking into my living room and finding my husband with another woman, I felt like maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. The blue guest room was larger than my entire downstairs at home, with windows that overlooked what appeared to be extensive gardens. Mrs. Morrison had left out a selection of Eleanor's nightgowns, each one silk or fine cotton, and probably worth more than my entire sleepwear collection. I chose a simple blue silk one that felt like wearing a cloud. As I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a text message. Richard, Margaret, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but walking out isn't going to solve anything. I'm at the Hampton Inn on Route 9. Call me when you're ready to discuss this like adults. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Discussing it like adults, as if I was the one who'd been behaving childishly by objecting to finding him tongue-deep with his secretary under our Christmas tree. There was a soft knock at my door. Come in, I called, expecting Mrs. Morrison with extra towels or something. Instead, Eleanor appeared in the doorway wearing a beautiful cream-colored robe and carrying 2 mugs of what smelled like hot chocolate. I thought you might like something warm before bed, she said, offering me one of the mugs. Mrs. Morrison makes the most wonderful hot chocolate. Secret ingredient is a splash of bourbon. That sounds perfect, I said, accepting the mug gratefully. Eleanor settled into the reading chair by the window, looking surprisingly alert for someone who'd been confused just hours earlier. Margaret, she said, I hope you don't think I was being pushy earlier. About David, about this job. I worry about him. You weren't pushy, I assured her. Well, maybe a little pushy, but in a nice way. Eleanor smiled. Harold always said I had the subtlety of a freight train when I thought I was helping people. But David, he's been so alone since Catherine left. And since his father died, he's been taking care of everyone else but himself. What was Harold like? I asked. Eleanor's face softened. Brilliant. Funny. Stubborn as a mule when he thought he was right, which was most of the time. He was a professor at the university, American history. He specialized in Civil War-era documents and letters. The papers David wants you to organize are Harold's life's work. That sounds like a fascinating project. It is. Harold spent 40 years collecting documents, letters, photographs from families whose ancestors fought in the war. He was planning to write a book about the ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. Eleanor's voice grew sad. He never got to finish it. How did he die? Heart attack. Sudden. One day he was working in his study, excited about some new letters he'd acquired from an estate sale, and the next morning, she shrugged, but I could see the pain still sharp in her eyes. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." It was. "But you know what the worst part is? I'm forgetting him, little pieces at a time. Some days I can't remember what his voice sounded like, or the way he laughed at his own jokes." She looked out the window into the darkness. "David thinks I don't notice the confusion getting worse, but I do. Most of the time, anyway." I didn't know what to say to that. How do you comfort someone who's losing their own memories? "That's why I want David to find someone," Eleanor continued. "Someone who can love him the way Harold loved me. Someone who can create new memories with him before I forget all the old ones." "Mrs. Hawthorne, Eleanor, and I know what you're thinking. I just met you. I don't really know anything about you, and here I am, hoping you might be interested in my son." She laughed. "I told you I have the subtlety of a freight train." "It's not that," I said, though it kind of was that. "It's just, I found out about my husband's affair 3 hours ago. I'm not exactly in the market for romance right now." "Of course not," Eleanor agreed. "But Margaret, you strike me as the kind of woman who picks herself up and moves forward. And David is worth moving forward toward, when you're ready. What makes you so sure?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, sipping her hot chocolate. "Because when you told us about finding your husband with that woman tonight, David got angry. Really angry. I could see it, even if he was trying to hide it, and David doesn't get angry on behalf of people he doesn't care about." That was an interesting observation. David had been very controlled during our conversation. But thinking back, there had been moments when his professional composure had slipped. "Eleanor," I said carefully, "what happened with David and Catherine?" "Really?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "Catherine was beautiful, sophisticated, came from the right family. Everything David thought he wanted in a wife. They were planning a wedding for the following spring. What went wrong? David caught her with his business partner. In David's own office after hours, she said it wasn't serious, just a mistake, begged him to forgive her." Eleanor's voice turned bitter. "David tried to work through it because he thought that was what mature adults did. Went to counseling, talked about rebuilding trust, all of that. But it wasn't just once, and it wasn't just his business partner. Catherine liked excitement, liked having options. She was bored by David's stability, by his loyalty. She wanted someone who would keep her guessing." Eleanor met my eyes. "Does that sound familiar?" It did sound familiar. Richard's sudden fascination with Holly, his complaints about our boring routine, his comments about how we'd grown apart. Maybe he'd been looking for excitement too. How did David find out about the others? Private investigator. David hired one when he started noticing things. Unexplained absences. Mysterious phone calls, credit card charges she couldn't account for. Turned out Catherine had been having affairs for most of their 3-year relationship. That's awful. It was. But you know what the worst part was? Catherine tried to blame David. Said he was too controlling, too focused on work, that she needed someone more spontaneous. Eleanor's voice turned fierce. As if David's character flaws justified her lying and cheating for 3 years. I thought about Richard's comment that we'd grown apart. As if our marriage problems were something that had happened to us instead of choices he'd made. What did David do? Threw her out, changed the locks, canceled the wedding, divided their business assets, and bought her out of her share of the company. Eleanor smiled grimly. Harold was so proud of how David handled it. No drama, no begging, just clean, decisive action. And he hasn't been serious about anyone since? A few dates here and there, but nothing substantial. I think he's afraid to trust again. And since Harold died and my condition got worse, he's been so focused on taking care of me that he doesn't have time for a personal life. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our spiked hot chocolate and looking out at the gardens. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've shared tonight, ask away. When you found your husband with that woman, were you surprised? Really surprised? Or had you been ignoring signs for a while?" I thought about that. Both, I think. I was shocked in the moment. But looking back, there were things. He'd been working late more often, paying more attention to his appearance. Seemed distracted when we talked. I told myself it was just work stress. "We see what we want to see," Eleanor said gently. "I did the same thing when Harold was getting sick. He'd forget little things, repeat stories, seem confused about dates. I told myself he was just tired, working too hard. It took months for me to admit something was really wrong. Do you regret waiting? Every day. We could have had more time to prepare, to make better decisions about his care. More time to say the important things. Eleanor looked at me seriously. Don't waste time pretending things are fine when they're not, Margaret. Life's too short and too unpredictable. There was another soft knock at the door. This time it was David, looking slightly embarrassed. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said. Mother, you should be getting to bed. And Margaret, I wanted to apologize for earlier, for Mother's rather direct matchmaking attempts. No apology necessary, I said. She's worried about you. She worries about everyone, David said with affection. It's one of her most endearing and exasperating qualities. Eleanor stood up, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. David, will you help me to my room? I'm feeling a bit tired. Of course, Mother. As they reached the door, Eleanor turned back to me. Margaret, thank you again for tonight, for helping an old woman who was lost in more ways than one. Thank you for taking me in, I said, for giving me somewhere to land while I figure out what comes next. After they left, I sat in the reading chair, finishing my hot chocolate, and thinking about the strange turns this day had taken. This morning, I'd been a married woman looking forward to Christmas with my husband. Tonight, I was staying in a mansion, planning to spend 2 weeks organizing the papers of a dead historian, and trying not to think about the way David Hawthorne's eyes had softened when he talked about his mother. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Richard. Margaret, please call me. We've been married 28 years. We owe it to each other to talk this through. I made a mistake, but I love you. I stared at the message for a long time. 28 years. That was worth something, wasn't it? People made mistakes. People could change. But then I thought about Catherine, who had blamed David for her own betrayals. I thought about Eleanor's advice not to waste time pretending things were fine when they weren't. And I thought about the way Richard had looked when I'd found him with Holly. Not guilty, not ashamed, but annoyed at being interrupted. I deleted the message and turned off my phone. Tomorrow I would start organizing Harold Hawthorne's papers. Tomorrow I would begin the process of figuring out what my life looked like without Richard in it. Tomorrow I would start learning what it meant to stop pretending everything was fine. But tonight, I was going to sleep in silk pajamas that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, in a room larger than my entire downstairs, in a house where people said exactly what they meant and took in strangers who needed help. Tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I might actually be exactly where I needed to be. That's when I realized that sometimes the worst day of your life can also be the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to you. The next morning, Mrs. Morrison woke me with coffee and what she called a proper breakfast. Eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, and pastries that looked like they belonged in a magazine. After 28 years of grabbing granola bars on my way out the door, being served breakfast in bed felt surreal. Mr. David is waiting for you in his father's study when you're ready, she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. No rush, though. He said to tell you that Harold's papers have been waiting 3 years. They can wait another hour. After breakfast and a shower with water pressure that could strip paint, I found myself standing outside a heavy oak door at the end of a hallway lined with family portraits. I knocked and heard David's voice telling me to come in. Harold Hawthorne's study was exactly what you'd expect from a historian. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, and papers. Mountains of papers. Boxes lined every available surface, filing cabinets stood like sentinels along the walls, and loose documents were scattered across every horizontal surface like a paper blizzard had blown through the room. David was standing in the middle of it all, looking like a man who'd been handed a puzzle with 10,000 pieces and no picture on the box. "Good morning," he said, looking almost embarrassed. "I should have warned you. It's worse than I remembered." "It's not that bad," I lied, surveying the chaos. "I've seen worse." This was also a lie, but he didn't need to know that. "You're being kind. It looks like a research library exploded." He gestured helplessly at the nearest stack of papers. "I've been putting this off because every time I come in here, I get overwhelmed and leave." "What exactly did your father collect?" "Everything." David picked up a leather-bound journal and opened it carefully. Civil War letters, diary entries, photographs, military records, family documents. He bought entire estate collections when families were cleaning out attics. Some of this stuff dates back to 1860. I moved closer to look at the journal in his hands. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, faded but still legible. The writer was describing a battle, and the words were so vivid I could almost smell the gunpowder. "This is incredible," I said, forgetting my professional composure. "These are primary source documents. Do you realize how valuable this collection is historically?" That's what my father always said. He thought he could organize it all into a book about ordinary people living through the Civil War. Stories from soldiers' wives, children, farmers, people whose voices usually get lost in history books. That's a wonderful concept. What stopped him? David's expression grew sad. Time. He kept collecting faster than he could organize. Every estate sale, every antique dealer, every family cleaning out old attics. If there were Civil War-era documents, Dad had to have them. I could see Harold's passion in the careful way the documents were stored, the acid-free boxes, the climate control. This wasn't hoarding. This was love. "Where would you like me to start?" I asked. Honestly, anywhere. I was thinking maybe chronological organization first, then by document type. I don't know. You're the expert. I wasn't exactly an expert in historical document organization, but I'd organized enough library collections to have a system. Let's start with a basic inventory. We need to know what we're dealing with before we can organize it properly. We worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, David reading dates and locations while I made lists. It quickly became clear that Harold Hawthorne had been even more thorough than his son realized. There were letters from dozens of different families, photographs with detailed notes about who was in them, and official military documents that belonged in museums. "David," I said, holding up a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are from a woman named Sarah to her husband during Sherman's march to the sea. Do you know what these would be worth to a Civil War museum? Dad never wanted to sell anything. He said these were people's lives, not commodities. I'm not suggesting selling them. I'm suggesting your father's collection could become a significant historical archive. Universities would be interested in this. Museums would want to create exhibits." David stopped sorting and looked at me. "You really think it's that important? I think your father spent 40 years preserving voices that would otherwise be lost forever. That's not just important. It's invaluable." Something shifted in David's expression as I spoke. The careful politeness he'd maintained since last night softened into something that looked like genuine interest. "Tell me more," he said. So I did. I told him about the historical significance of personal documents, about how letters and diaries give us insights into how ordinary people experienced major historical events. I explained how his father's work could become a lasting legacy, helping future generations understand the human cost of war. "You really love this, don't you?" David asked when I paused for breath. "I love history, yes. But more than that, I love stories. Every one of these documents tells a story about real people who loved and lost and hoped and grieved. Your father understood that. He would have liked you," David said quietly. "Dad always said the best historians were the ones who remembered that history is about people, not dates and battles." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, like he was trying to solve a puzzle I didn't know I'd presented. "David, is everything all right?" "Yes, it's just—" He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "There's something familiar about you. Something I can't quite place. Have we met before? Before last night, I mean?" My heart did a funny little skip. There was something familiar about him too, though I couldn't pinpoint what. Something about his smile, the way he moved his hands when he talked, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. "I don't think so," I said slowly. "I'm pretty sure I'd remember meeting you. You're probably right. It's just one of those déjà vu feelings, I suppose." We went back to work, but the conversation had changed something between us. The polite distance from this morning had given way to easier conversation, shared laughter when we found particularly dramatic letters, and a growing awareness that we worked well together. Eleanor appeared at lunchtime with sandwiches, and what she announced was proper supervision. "How's the work going?" she asked, settling into Harold's reading chair like she belonged there. "Your father was incredibly thorough," I told her, "but he had no organizational system whatsoever." "That sounds like Harold," Eleanor said fondly. He could remember the provenance of every document, but couldn't remember where he put his reading glasses. Speaking of remembering things, David said carefully, Mother, does Margaret remind you of anyone? Someone from a long time ago? Eleanor studied me with the sharp attention that seemed to come and go unpredictably. Now that you mention it, yes. She reminds me of that girl you used to date in college. What was her name? The one with the beautiful smile and the quick wit. Mother, I dated several girls in college. No, the special one. The one you brought home for Thanksgiving your senior year. The one you were planning to… Eleanor frowned, the thought slipping away like smoke. Oh, what was her name? Mother, I think you're confusing different people. But Eleanor was studying my face with increasing intensity. Margaret, what did you say your maiden name was? I didn't mention it, I said, feeling oddly nervous. It was Collins. Margaret Collins. Eleanor's face went completely still. Then she turned to David with an expression of absolute shock. David, she said slowly, look at her. Really look at her. David stared at me, and I watched his expression change as something clicked into place. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. Margaret Collins, he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. You two know each other, Eleanor said with satisfaction. I knew it. The moment you walked into that diner together, I knew there was something. We don't know each other, I said quickly, though my heart was pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. We just met last night. But David was shaking his head slowly. No, he said. We didn't just meet. We've met before, a long time ago. When? I asked, though part of me was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Thanksgiving dinner, 1994, David said quietly. You were a senior at State, art history major. You wore a blue dress that matched your eyes, and you made my mother laugh so hard at dinner that she snorted wine through her nose. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I remembered that Thanksgiving. I remembered the fancy house, the intimidating parents, the handsome boy who'd brought me home to meet his family. I remembered falling completely head over heels for a boy named David, but his last name hadn't been Hawthorne. It had been David Harrison, I whispered. I went by my middle name in college, he said. David Harrison Hawthorne. I thought it sounded less pretentious than the full name. Eleanor was looking back and forth between us like she was watching the world's most interesting tennis match. Well, she said finally, this is going to be interesting. That's when I realized that the strange familiarity, the sense of déjà vu, the feeling that I'd been here before, it was because I had been here before. 29 years ago, I'd sat at David Hawthorne's family dinner table and fallen in love with him. And then I'd waited for him to call me back after winter break, and he never did. The silence in Harold's study stretched until it felt like a living thing. I stared at David Harrison, the boy who'd broken my 21-year-old heart, and tried to process what was happening. Eleanor was watching us both with the kind of expression usually reserved for particularly fascinating museum exhibits. I think, Eleanor said finally, I should leave you two alone to sort this out. She stood up with more energy than I'd seen from her since last night. But before I go, David, you absolute fool, you never told me you let this one get away. Mother, David said, but Eleanor was already heading for the door. Don't mother me. Margaret, dear, make him explain himself properly. And David, don't screw this up again. The door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving us alone with 29 years of unresolved history floating in the air between us. Margaret, David said quietly, I can explain. Can you? I asked. And I was proud that my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've had plenty of time to explain. Like, say, 29 years. He flinched. You're angry. I'm confused. There's a difference. Though anger might be coming. I sat down in the nearest chair, mainly because my legs felt unreliable. You're David Harrison. The David Harrison who took me to his parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner, who told me he loved me, who said he'd call me after winter break. Yes, the David Harrison who disappeared without a word. No phone call, no letter, no explanation. Just gone. Yes, his voice was barely audible. And now, 29 years later, you show up as David Hawthorne, mysterious, wealthy businessman whose mother I happened to find wandering outside a church. It's not what you think. I think you owe me an explanation. A really good one. David sat down heavily in his father's desk chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that was achingly familiar. After Thanksgiving break, my father called me into his study. He'd been watching you, watching us together, and he'd done some research. Research? Into your family background. Your father was a mechanic. Your mother worked part-time at a grocery store. You were paying for college with student loans and scholarships. David's voice was flat, emotionless. My father informed me that you were obviously a gold digger. I felt my mouth fall open. A gold digger? He said girls like you targeted boys from wealthy families, that you'd probably researched our family before accepting my invitation home, that you were using me to get access to money. And you believed him? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I was 22 years old, and I'd never gone against my father's wishes in my life, David said miserably. He threatened to cut off my trust fund if I continued seeing you, said I could choose between the family fortune and a fortune hunter. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this story with the confident, successful man sitting across from me. So you chose the money. I chose what I thought was my future. My father had my entire life planned out. Law school, joining the family business, marrying someone from an appropriate family. Fighting him meant giving up everything I thought I wanted. And calling me to explain was, "What? Too much trouble?" David's face flushed. I was a coward. I knew if I heard your voice, if I had to explain why I was choosing money over you, I'd lose my nerve, so I just didn't call. For 29 years. For 29 years. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. 21-year-old Margaret had been devastated when David vanished. She'd spent months wondering what she'd done wrong, replaying every conversation for signs she'd missed. She'd eventually convinced herself that what they'd shared hadn't been as special as she'd thought. "You know what the really funny part is?" I said finally. "What?" "I never knew your family had money. You drove a beat-up Honda? You wore jeans with holes in them? You took me to cheap restaurants? I thought you were just another broke college student." David's head snapped up. "You didn't know? How would I know? You never mentioned it. You never acted like someone from a wealthy family." The fancy house was my first clue, and by then, I was too nervous about meeting your parents to think about what it meant. "You really didn't know," David said slowly, and something in his expression was shifting. I fell in love with David Harrison, broke college student who made me laugh and argued with me about books and kissed me like the world was ending. Your father's money never entered into it. Oh, God! David buried his face in his hands. Oh, God, what did I do? You chose money over love. People do it all the time. No, you don't understand. I didn't just choose money. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because my father convinced me it wasn't real. He looked up at me, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Margaret, what we had, that was real, wasn't it? I didn't imagine it." "It was real," I said softly. "At least it was real for me. For me, too. I've spent 29 years trying to find something that felt like what we had. I never did." "Is that why you never married? Because you were pining for your lost college love?" I meant it to sound sarcastic, but it came out gentler than I'd intended. "Partly, but mostly because after Catherine, I realized my father had been wrong about you, but right about one thing. I was terrible at judging people's real motives. I kept attracting women who saw dollar signs instead of me. So you just stopped trying? I stopped trusting. There's a difference." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of 29 years of misunderstanding settling between us. I thought about the young woman I'd been, how devastated I'd been by his disappearance, how long it had taken me to trust another man enough to marry him. "David," I said finally, I need you to understand something. What happened between us in college, that was a lifetime ago. I'm not the same person I was at 21. Neither am I. I was married for 28 years. I loved my husband. Not the way I loved you. That was different, deeper maybe. But I loved him. Until yesterday, I thought I was happy. And now? Now I don't know what I think. My entire life has been turned upside down in the last 24 hours. Finding out about Richard's affair, meeting your mother, coming here, and now this. I gestured between us. I can't process all of this at once. I understand. Do you? Because I feel like you're looking at me and seeing that 21-year-old girl you used to know. But she's gone, David. I'm 54 years old, I'm getting divorced, and I have no idea what I want my life to look like going forward. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. You're right, he said finally. I am seeing that girl, but I'm also seeing the woman who helped my mother last night, who treated her with kindness when she could have just called the police. I'm seeing someone who gets excited talking about historical documents and who can make my mother laugh. I'm seeing someone who's brave enough to walk away from a bad marriage and start over. And I'd like to get to know who you are now. Not who you were 29 years ago, but who you are today, if you'll let me. I looked at this man, who was simultaneously a stranger and achingly familiar. The boy I'd fallen in love with had been sweet, idealistic, full of dreams about changing the world. This man was more careful, more guarded, carrying his own share of disappointments and betrayals. I can't promise anything, I said. I don't know what I want right now beyond getting through the next 2 weeks. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I'm not the same coward who disappeared 29 years ago. What about your mother? She's clearly hoping this is some kind of romantic reunion. My mother has been hoping I'd find someone to love for the past 5 years. She'd probably be matchmaking even if we were complete strangers. And Mrs. Morrison? And the people who work for you? What are they going to think about your mother's librarian friend moving into the house? They're going to think I'm finally doing something right for once. I laughed despite myself. You're very sure of yourself. I'm not sure of anything. But Margaret, finding you again, even under these circumstances, it feels like a second chance. And I'm old enough now to know how rare those are. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Eleanor poked her head in, looking hopeful. Are you two finished sorting out your past? She asked. Because Mrs. Morrison wants to know if Margaret will be staying for dinner, and I need to know if I should ask her to set out the good china. David and I looked at each other. 29 years of questions hung in the air between us, but underneath that, there was something else. The faint echo of what we'd once felt for each other, changed by time, but not completely gone. Yes, I said, surprising myself. I'll stay for dinner. But Eleanor? Yes, dear? Maybe just the regular china. I'm not sure I'm ready for the good stuff yet. Eleanor beamed like I'd given her the perfect Christmas present. Regular china it is. But Margaret? Yes? The good china will be waiting when you're ready for it. As the door closed behind her, I realized that Eleanor wasn't just talking about dishes. She was talking about letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, some endings were actually new beginnings in disguise. Dinner that night was surreal in the best possible way. We ate in what Eleanor called the small dining room, which was only small compared to the formal dining room that could apparently seat 24 people. Mrs. Morrison had prepared something called beef bourguignon that tasted like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant. And Eleanor regaled us with stories about David's childhood that made him blush like a teenager. Did I tell you about the time David decided he was going to be a professional baseball player? Eleanor asked, passing me the wine that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Mother, please don't. He was 12 years old and absolutely convinced that the Yankees were going to scout him. So Harold built him a pitching mound in the backyard, and David spent the entire summer throwing baseballs at a target painted on the garage door. That's sweet, I said, trying to picture serious, controlled David as an enthusiastic 12-year-old. Oh, it gets better. He convinced Harold to time his pitches and keep statistics. Poor Harold spent hours crouched behind a catcher's mitt, writing down numbers while David practiced his major league delivery. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I knew. High school baseball tryouts. David threw exactly 3 pitches before the coach told him to try debate team instead. Eleanor was grinning. Harold said watching David's dreams of athletic glory die was like watching a flower wilt in fast motion. I made varsity debate team, David said defensively. We went to state championships. Yes, dear. Much more appropriate for someone with your particular talents. I watched this exchange with fascination. This was a side of David I'd never seen. The beloved only son, gently teased by parents who clearly adored him. It made me wonder what other parts of himself he'd hidden when we were young. What about you, Margaret? Eleanor asked. What did you want to be when you grew up? An archaeologist, I said without thinking. I wanted to discover ancient civilizations and solve historical mysteries. What changed your mind? I thought about 21-year-old Margaret, full of dreams about graduate school and exotic dig sites. Reality, I suppose. Archaeology requires advanced degrees, funding, the ability to travel extensively. After David and I caught myself. After college ended, I needed a practical career that would let me support myself immediately. So you became a librarian, David said quietly. I became a librarian. It lets me work with books and research, help people find information they need. It's not archaeology, but it's good work. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked. No, I said and realized I meant it. I like my work. I like helping people. And I've had a good life, even if it wasn't the life I planned at 21. But, Eleanor prompted, because apparently she could hear the unspoken thoughts in my voice. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver, if I'd pursued graduate school anyway, taken more risks, not let practical concerns make all my decisions. David was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. It's not too late, he said. You're 54, not 94. If you wanted to go back to school, pursue archaeology now. At my age? Don't be ridiculous. Why is that ridiculous? You have experience, education, presumably some financial resources now that you're getting divorced. What's stopping you except the assumption that you're too old? I opened my mouth to list all the practical reasons why it was impossible, then stopped. Why was it impossible? Because I'd accepted the idea that dreams had expiration dates. Because I'd spent so many years being practical that I'd forgotten how to be brave? She could audit some classes, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Get a feel for whether she really wants to pursue it seriously. The State University has an excellent archaeology program, David added. I should know. I've donated enough money to their department over the years. They were both looking at me like this was a perfectly reasonable conversation instead of a complete upheaval of everything I'd accepted about my life. This is crazy, I said. 3 days ago, I was a married librarian planning Christmas dinner with my husband. Now you're suggesting I become a middle-aged graduate student? I'm suggesting you become whoever you want to become, David said. Age is just a number. Easy for you to say. You're successful, wealthy, established. I'm about to be divorced and unemployed. Temporarily unemployed, Eleanor corrected. And only temporarily divorced if you're smart about it. I stared at her. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Eleanor said with a sly smile, that some divorces lead to better marriages. Mother, David warned. What? I'm just saying that sometimes you have to clear out the old to make room for the new. She turned to me conspiratorially. Margaret, dear, you do realize my son is quite the catch? Successful, handsome, excellent provider, and he makes wonderful beef stew. You make beef stew? I asked David, latching onto the least complicated part of that statement. It's one of my 3 dishes, he admitted. Beef stew, grilled chicken, and scrambled eggs. I'm not exactly what you'd call a chef, but he's very good at ordering takeout, Eleanor added helpfully, and he owns stock in several excellent restaurants. Despite everything, I found myself laughing. Eleanor, you're shameless. Completely shameless, she agreed cheerfully. At my age, subtlety is a waste of time. I like you, Margaret. You're good for David. You make him laugh, you challenge him, and you're not afraid of him. Afraid of him? Most women are intimidated by David's money, his success, his serious demeanor. They either want to change him or they want to spend his fortune. You just want him to explain himself properly and help with historical documents. It's refreshing. I glanced at David, who was looking like he wished the floor would swallow him. Is that true? Are people usually afraid of you? People are usually interested in what I can do for them, he said carefully. It gets hard to tell who likes me versus who likes my resources. That must be lonely. It is. There was something in his voice that made my chest tighten. I thought about Richard, who'd ultimately chosen excitement and novelty over 28 years of partnership. I thought about Catherine, who'd betrayed David's trust for years. It occurred to me that both David and I had learned to be careful, to protect ourselves, to expect disappointment. Well, I said finally, you don't have to worry about that with me. I don't need your money. I'm not intimidated by your success, and I'm too old to be impressed by anyone's serious demeanor. Too old? David raised an eyebrow. Too experienced. There's a difference. Eleanor clapped her hands together delightedly. Perfect. It's settled then. Margaret will stay and help David with Harold's papers, and we'll see what develops naturally. Mother, you can't just declare people's romantic futures like you're planning a dinner party. Watch me, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Harold always said I had excellent instincts about people, and my instincts say you two belong together. After dinner, David walked me up to my room, an oddly formal gesture that reminded me of being brought home after dates in college. I want to apologize, he said when we reached my door, for my mother's matchmaking. She means well, but she's not subtle. I noticed that. It's actually kind of endearing. Is it? I was afraid it might scare you away. David, after the week I've had, very little could scare me at this point. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you really think I should consider going back to school? Or were you just being polite? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. I think you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. I think you light up when you talk about history and research. I think you've spent 28 years taking care of other people, and maybe it's time to take care of your own dreams. That's a very generous assessment from someone who's known me for exactly 24 hours. I've known you longer than 24 hours. Different versions of you maybe, but I've known your heart, Margaret. That hasn't changed. Before I could respond to that unexpectedly intimate statement, my phone rang. Richard's number flashed on the screen, and I felt the pleasant warmth of the evening chill immediately. I should take this, I said reluctantly. Of course. Good night, Margaret. Good night. I waited until David disappeared down the hallway before answering the phone. Margaret, thank God. Richard's voice was tight with frustration. I've been calling you all day. Where are you? I'm staying with friends. What friends? I called Linda. I called your sister. I even called the library. No one knows where you are. The fact that he'd been tracking me down through my friends and family felt invasive rather than concerned. Richard, I don't owe you a detailed itinerary of my whereabouts. You're my wife. I'm your wife who found you kissing your secretary under our Christmas tree. That changes things. Margaret, please, can we meet somewhere and talk? Really talk? I know I made a mistake, but we can work through this. 28 years of marriage is worth fighting for. I thought about 28 years of marriage. The good parts, the comfortable routine, the shared history. Then I thought about the smell of Holly's perfume in my living room, about Richard's annoyance at being interrupted instead of guilt at being caught. Richard, are you still seeing her? Silence. Richard, are you still involved with Holly? It's complicated, he said finally. No, it's not complicated. It's a yes or no question. Margaret, if you'd just let me explain, are you still sleeping with her? Another long pause. Yes, but I hung up. My phone immediately started ringing again. I turned it off and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the device like it was a poisonous snake. 28 years of marriage, and he was still choosing her, still making excuses, still acting like I was the problem for not being understanding enough about his affair. There was a soft knock at my door. Come in, I called, thinking it might be Mrs. Morrison with extra towels. Instead, David appeared in the doorway, looking concerned. I heard your phone ringing. Is everything all right? Richard called. Ah. David stepped into the room, but stayed near the door, clearly unsure if he was intruding. How did that go? He's still with her. His secretary. He wanted to meet and work things out, but he's still sleeping with the woman he cheated with. I'm sorry. You know what the worst part is? I think I actually considered it. For about 30 seconds, I thought maybe Eleanor was right and I should fight for my marriage. I laughed, but it came out bitter. 28 years, and he's already chosen her over me. Again. David moved closer, his expression shifting from polite concern to something that looked like barely controlled anger. He's an idiot. Excuse me? Your husband is an idiot. You're intelligent, kind, beautiful, funny, and he's throwing that away for someone who was willing to have an affair with a married man? David shook his head. I take it back. He's not an idiot. He's a fool. Beautiful? I asked, because out of everything he'd said, that was the word that stuck. David's eyes met mine. You were beautiful at 21. You're stunning at 54. The air in the room seemed to change, becoming charged with possibility. We were standing closer than we'd been all day, and I could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, the faint lines at the corners that spoke of years of experience I'd never shared with him. David, I said quietly, I know. Too soon. Too complicated. Too much history. He stepped back, putting safe distance between us again. I should let you get some rest. Wait. The word came out before I could stop it. You said you wanted a chance to show me you're not the same person who disappeared 29 years ago. Well, 29 years ago, you would have listened to your father's opinion about what you should do and who you should care about. What would you do now? Now? If someone told you that I was wrong for you, that you should choose security over following your heart, what would you do now? David looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him understanding what I was really asking. Now, he said quietly, I'd tell them that I've spent 29 years regretting the last time I made that choice, and that I'm not making the same mistake twice. Good answer, I said. Good question. We stood there looking at each other. 29 years of separation and 24 hours of rediscovery hanging between us like a bridge we weren't quite ready to cross. Good night, Margaret, David said finally. Good night. But as he reached the door, I called his name one more time. David? Tomorrow, when we're working on your father's papers, could you tell me more about what happened between us? Not the ending, I think I understand that now, but the beginning. I'd like to remember the good parts. His smile was soft and sad and full of promise. I'd like that too. After he left, I got ready for bed thinking about choices and second chances and the strange way life sometimes circled back on itself. 3 days ago, my biggest concern was what to make Richard for Christmas dinner. Now I was lying in a mansion, wondering if it was possible to fall in love with the same person twice, 29 years later. Outside my window, snow had started to fall, covering the gardens in pristine white. It looked like a fresh start. The next morning brought what Eleanor cheerfully announced was a proper snow day. At least 8 inches had fallen overnight, turning the estate into something out of a Christmas card. Mrs. Morrison informed us that several roads were closed and David's morning meetings had been canceled. Excellent, Eleanor declared over breakfast. That means we can all work together on Harold's papers. I have some stories about those documents that might help with the organization. I'd been looking forward to another day alone with David, learning more about our shared past and figuring out what, if anything, existed between us now. The prospect of Eleanor's supervision felt both safer and more disappointing. Mother, are you sure you want to spend the day in Dad's study? It's dusty, there's no comfortable seating, and some of those boxes are heavy. David Harrison Hawthorne, Eleanor said with mock severity. I lived with your father for 45 years. I know those documents as well as anyone. Besides, Margaret might want to hear some of the stories behind the letters. She wasn't wrong. Spending the morning listening to Eleanor's stories about Harold's research had been fascinating. She remembered details about specific families, could identify people in unmarked photographs, and had opinions about which documents were most historically significant. This one, she said, holding up a faded daguerreotype of a young woman in a dark dress, is Lucy Matthews. She was 19 when her husband enlisted, 21 when she got word that he'd been killed at Gettysburg. Harold found her letters in an estate sale in Virginia. What happened to her after the war? I asked. She never remarried, raised her son alone, took in sewing to support them. Her letters to her sister talk about how she still felt married to Thomas, even though he was gone. Eleanor looked at the photograph thoughtfully. Harold always said Lucy's story showed how love could survive anything, even death. David and I exchanged glances. There was something about the way Eleanor told that story that seemed pointed, though I couldn't figure out exactly what point she was making. Speaking of love surviving, Eleanor continued with studied casualness, David, why don't you show Margaret that box of letters Harold was most proud of? The ones from the couple who found each other again after the war. Mother, I'm not sure which ones you mean. Yes, you are. The blue ribbon box. The letters between James and Catherine Morrison. David looked uncomfortable. Mother, those are some of the most fragile documents in the collection. Maybe we should wait. Nonsense. Margaret's a professional. She knows how to handle historical documents. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. Besides, it's exactly the kind of story she should know about if she's going to help organize this collection properly. 15 minutes later, David reluctantly produced an archival box tied with a blue ribbon. The letters inside were written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. The ink faded to brown. These are incredible, I breathed, examining the careful handwriting. The preservation is remarkable. James Morrison was a Union soldier from Ohio, Eleanor explained. Catherine was a school teacher he met while stationed near her town. They fell in love, got engaged, and then James was transferred to a different regiment before they could marry. I picked up one of the letters carefully, squinting to read the faded text. This is beautiful. He's writing about wanting to build her a house after the war, about the children they'll have together. Keep reading, Eleanor said quietly. The next letter was different. James was writing about being wounded, about infection setting in, about knowing he might not survive. He was releasing Catherine from their engagement, telling her to find someone else, to be happy. Oh, this is heartbreaking, I said. He's telling her to forget him. Read Catherine's response, Eleanor suggested. Catherine's letters were fierce, passionate refusals to give up. She wrote about waiting for him, about believing he would recover, about love being stronger than fear or distance or even death. The letters stopped there, David said quietly. Dad always assumed James died, and Catherine eventually moved on. But he didn't die, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Harold found James's military records. He recovered, was discharged in 1865, and spent 3 years trying to find Catherine. Her family had moved west. No forwarding address. Meanwhile, Catherine had given up hope and accepted a proposal from another man. So they lost each other, I said sadly, for 23 years. Then James saw Catherine's name in a newspaper. Her husband had died, and she was listed among the bereaved in his obituary. James wrote to her immediately. After 23 years? After 23 years? Harold found their reunion letters in a different estate sale from James's nephew. They married within 6 months of reconnecting and had 15 happy years together before James died. I was staring at the letters, trying to imagine the courage it must have taken to reach out to someone after more than 2 decades. That's an incredible story. Harold always said it proved that real love doesn't have an expiration date, that some connections are strong enough to survive anything. Separation, time, other relationships, even the assumption that what you had was over forever. The room had gone very quiet. David was watching Eleanor with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what point she was making, and Eleanor was watching me with the look of someone who'd just played her ace. "Mother," David said carefully, "I think Margaret gets the point." "Do you, dear?" Eleanor asked me innocently. Because the thing about James and Catherine that Harold found most remarkable wasn't that they found each other again. It was that they were brave enough to try again, despite everything that had gone wrong the first time. Before I could respond to that extremely unsubtle piece of matchmaking, Mrs. Morrison appeared in the doorway looking flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but Mrs. Hawthorne, there's a man at the door claiming to be Margaret's husband. He's quite insistent about seeing her." My stomach dropped. "Richard's here? He says he's not leaving until he talks to you. He seems determined." I looked out the window at the snow-covered driveway and saw Richard's Mercedes sedan parked behind David's car, blocking the drive. Even from the second floor, I could see that Richard was dressed for battle. His best suit, expensive coat, the watch I'd given him for our 20th anniversary. He'd come prepared to be impressive. "How did he find me?" I asked, though part of me already suspected. "I may have mentioned where you were staying when I called Linda yesterday," Mrs. Morrison admitted reluctantly. "I needed to let someone know where you were for emergency purposes. I didn't think—" "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't fine at all. "I'll handle this." "You don't have to handle anything alone," David said, standing up. "This is my house. I can ask him to leave." "No." I stood up too, straightening my shoulders. "This is my problem. I need to deal with it myself." "Margaret," Eleanor said gently, "you don't owe that man anything. Not after what he's done." "I know. But I owe myself the chance to say what I need to say to him, to end this properly." "Then we'll be right here when you're finished," David said. 5 minutes later, I was standing in the formal living room facing my husband of 28 years. Richard looked older than he had 3 days ago, more tired, but he'd clearly made an effort to present his best self. The charming smile, the expensive clothes, the confident posture that had attracted me when we first met. "Margaret," he said, moving toward me with his arms outstretched like he expected a hug. "Thank God. I was so worried about you." I stepped back, maintaining distance between us. "How did you find me, Richard?" I was persistent, called everyone we know until someone mentioned you might be staying with the Hawthorns. He looked around the elegant room, taking in the expensive furniture, the artwork, the crystal chandelier. This is quite a place. How exactly do you know these people? That's not really your concern anymore. Of course it's my concern. You're my wife. I'm your wife who caught you cheating. With your secretary, in our living room. That changes the dynamic considerably. Richard had the grace to look ashamed. Margaret, I know how this looks. I know I've hurt you. But what Holly and I have, it's not real. It's not like what we have. What we had, I corrected. And what you have with Holly looked pretty real when I walked in on you Tuesday night. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. Holly means nothing to me. Then why are you still sleeping with her? Richard's careful composure slipped slightly. Who told you that? You did. Last night on the phone. When I asked if you were still involved with her, you said yes. Margaret, you're not understanding the complexity of the situation. I understand perfectly. You want to keep both of us. You want me to be the understanding wife who forgives your affair. And you want to keep Holly as your exciting distraction. That's not... Richard, stop. I held up my hand. Just stop. I didn't ask you to come here. I don't want to hear your explanations, and I'm not interested in working things out. You're upset. I understand that. But Margaret, we've been married for 28 years. We have a life together, a history, shared investments. You can't just throw that away because of one mistake. It's not one mistake. It's 6 months of lies. It's 6 months of coming home to me after being with her. It's 6 months of sitting across from me at dinner and pretending to be faithful while you were planning your next rendezvous with your secretary. I never stopped loving you. You have a funny way of showing love. Richard moved closer, switching to the persuasive tone he used when he was trying to close a business deal. Margaret, I know you're hurt. I know I've damaged your trust, but we can rebuild that. People do it all the time. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, start fresh. With Holly? I'll end things with Holly. When? Soon. When the time is right. These things are delicate. Richard, listen to yourself. You're standing in front of your wife, asking her to take you back, while simultaneously refusing to end your affair. Do you hear how insane that sounds? I need time to handle the situation properly. No, the word came out sharper than I'd intended. You need to choose, right now, me or Holly. You don't get to have both. Richard's expression shifted, becoming calculating rather than pleading. Margaret, you're being unreasonable. You're staying in some stranger's house. You're clearly not thinking rationally. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. These people are obviously wealthy. Is that what this is about? You're trading up? The accusation was so ridiculous it almost made me laugh. Trading up? Come on, Margaret. Suddenly you're too good for our comfortable middle-class life? You need a mansion and servants? I need a husband who's faithful. You've made it clear that's not you. So you're just going to throw away our marriage and move in with some rich man you barely know? Who said anything about moving in with anyone? Though as soon as I said it, I realized Richard wasn't entirely wrong. I was staying in David's house. I was attracted to David, and Eleanor was clearly hoping something romantic would develop. I'm not blind, Margaret. This whole situation, finding these people, staying in their house, refusing to come home, it's obvious what's happening here. What's happening here is that I'm figuring out what my life looks like without a cheating husband. So that's it? 28 years of marriage, and you won't even try to work things out? I tried for 28 years to work things out. I supported your career, took care of your mother, managed our home, and made excuses when you started working late and losing interest in our marriage. The time for working things out was 6 months ago. Before you started sleeping with Holly. Richard's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the anger underneath. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, Margaret, fine. But don't expect this to be easy. I'm not just going to hand you half of everything we've built together. Everything we've built? Richard, I've supported your career for 28 years. I've contributed to our household income, managed our investments, and maintained our social relationships. I've earned my share of our assets. We'll see what the lawyers say about that. The threat hung in the air between us, ugly and final. This was who Richard really was underneath the charm and manipulation. Someone who would try to punish me financially for refusing to tolerate his betrayal. Is that your final answer? I asked quietly. Threats and intimidation? I'm being realistic about what divorce looks like. Then I guess we're done here. I turned to leave, but Richard caught my arm. Not roughly, but firmly enough to stop me. Margaret, wait. Don't end it like this. We're better than this. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. Let go of me, Richard. Just listen. Let go of me, now. That's when David appeared in the doorway, moving fast and looking dangerous. Is there a problem here? Richard immediately released my arm and straightened his jacket. No problem. Just a private conversation between husband and wife. Looked like more than conversation from where I was standing. David moved to stand beside me, not touching but clearly protective. Margaret, are you all right? I'm fine. Richard was just leaving. Actually, Richard said, his tone turning ugly, I'd like to know exactly what kind of relationship you have with my wife. The kind where I don't cheat on her, David said calmly. The words hung in the air like a slap. Richard's face went red, and for a moment I thought he might actually swing at David. But David was taller, younger, and looked like he could handle himself in a fight. You don't know what you're talking about, Richard said through gritted teeth. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know you've been having an affair for 6 months. I know you refused to end it when your wife asked you to choose. And I know you came here to threaten her when she wouldn't take you back. David's voice was steel wrapped in silk. What I don't know is why you think any of that makes you someone worth fighting for. This is none of your business. Margaret is my business now. The words sent a shock through me, though I wasn't sure if it was good shock or bad shock. Richard clearly took it as bad shock. Your business? She's been here for 3 days. Sometimes 3 days is long enough to recognize what 28 years should have taught you, David said. That Margaret deserves better than someone who treats her like a backup plan. Richard looked between David and me, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked like genuine shock. Margaret, you're serious about this. You're actually choosing this stranger over our marriage. I'm choosing myself, I said quietly. For the first time in 28 years, I'm choosing what's best for me instead of what's best for everyone else. And what's best for you is him. Richard gestured toward David with obvious disdain. What's best for me is being with someone who respects me, who's honest with me, who doesn't make me feel like I have to compete with other women for his attention. You barely know him. I know him better than you think, and I know that in 3 days he's shown me more consideration and respect than you have in months. Richard stared at me like I'd become a stranger. Maybe I had. This is a mistake, Margaret. You're going to regret this. The only thing I regret is not leaving sooner. After Richard left, spinning his wheels in the snow and fishtailing down the driveway in a display of wounded masculine pride, I stood in the living room feeling like I'd just survived a tornado. Are you okay? David asked gently. I think so. That was harder than I expected. You were magnificent. The way you stood up to him, refused to be intimidated. Your strength was incredible. I didn't feel strong. I felt terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. I looked at David, this man who'd defended me against my own husband, who'd stood beside me when I needed support, who'd somehow become essential to my happiness in just 3 days. David, what you said to Richard about me being your business now, too much too soon? I don't know. Maybe. But it felt right. It felt like someone was finally claiming me instead of just tolerating me. Margaret, David said, moving closer. I want to be very clear about something. When I said you were my business, I meant it. Not because I think I own you or control you, but because I care what happens to you. Because your happiness matters to me. Because the thought of you going back to someone who doesn't appreciate what he has makes me want to do things that would probably get me arrested. David, I know this is fast. I know it's complicated. I know we have history that complicates everything. But Margaret, what I feel for you, it's not just nostalgia for what we had 29 years ago. It's real, and it's now, and it's stronger than anything I've felt for anyone else. Before I could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway wearing an expression of supreme satisfaction. Well, she said, settling into a chair like she owned the place, which she did. That was entertaining. David, dear, I'm proud of you for finally standing up for what you want, instead of letting it walk away. Mother, this is a private conversation. In my living room, about the woman I found freezing outside a church and brought home specifically so you two could sort yourselves out. I think I've earned the right to observe the results of my matchmaking." "Your matchmaking?" Eleanor smiled like a cat with a bowl of cream. "Did you really think it was a coincidence that I got confused and wandered off near that church? Or that I specifically asked you to call David instead of 911? Or that I conveniently remembered Margaret's maiden name right when you were looking confused about why she seemed familiar?" David and I stared at her. "Mother, are you saying you faked getting lost?" "I'm saying I might have encouraged circumstances to unfold in a way that brought two people together who obviously belonged together." "Really, David? Did you think I'd forgotten about Margaret Collins? The girl you cried over for months after Christmas break your senior year? The one whose picture you kept hidden in your desk drawer until you were 30? You knew who Margaret was the moment you saw her?" "Of course I knew. A mother doesn't forget the girl who broke her son's heart, especially when it wasn't really her fault." Eleanor turned to me. "And you, dear, you've been carrying a torch for my stubborn son for nearly 30 years. Don't bother denying it. I can see it in the way you look at him." I felt my face flame red. "Eleanor, I was married until 3 days ago, to a man who didn't deserve you and whom you settled for because you thought David was lost to you forever. Well, now you know better." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor had just casually dismantled both David's and my carefully maintained emotional distance and laid out our feelings like evidence in a trial. "So," Eleanor continued cheerfully, "now that we've established that you two are still crazy about each other and that I engineered your reunion, what are you going to do about it?" David and I looked at each other. 29 years of separation and 3 days of growing attraction, creating a moment that felt suspended in time. "I have no idea," I said honestly. "Well," Eleanor said, standing up with determination, "lucky for you, I have plenty of ideas. But first, David, I think you should kiss her properly. 29 years is quite long enough to wait for a second chance." "Mother, kiss her, David, before you find another excuse to be noble and self-sacrificing." David looked at me, and I saw the exact moment when he decided to stop overthinking and start feeling. "Margaret," he said softly. "May I?" Instead of answering, I stepped closer and kissed him first. 29 years melted away in an instant. David's arms came around me like they'd never left, and I remembered exactly why I'd fallen so hard for him in college. He kissed me like I was precious, like I was worth waiting for, like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole adult life. When we finally broke apart, Eleanor was clapping softly. "Perfect," she said with satisfaction. "Now let's talk about wedding plans." "Wedding plans?" I squeaked, my voice going up an octave. "Eleanor, we just kissed for the first time in 29 years. Don't you think wedding talk is a bit premature?" "Nonsense," Eleanor said, settling back into her chair like a general planning a campaign. "You're 54 and 52 years old. At your age, why waste time with unnecessary dating rituals? You know each other, you're clearly compatible, and you've already been through enough heartbreak to appreciate what you have." David was still holding me, and I could feel him shaking with suppressed laughter. "Mother, I think Margaret might want to be divorced before we start planning the next wedding." "Details," Eleanor waved dismissively. "The important thing is that you finally found each other again. Everything else is just paperwork." I looked up at David, expecting him to be embarrassed by his mother's assumption. Instead, he was looking at me with an expression that made my heart skip. "She's not entirely wrong," he said quietly, "about not wanting to waste time, about knowing what we have. David, we've been reacquainted for 3 days. I've been in love with you for 29 years. The reacquaintance is just catching up." The simple honesty of that statement took my breath away. You've been in love with me for 29 years? Every relationship I've had since college has failed because I was comparing every woman to the memory of Margaret Collins. Every time someone disappointed me or betrayed my trust, I thought about how you never would have done that. You set the standard, and no one else ever measured up. I stared at him, trying to process this information. That's not healthy, David. Probably not. But it's the truth. Eleanor was watching this exchange with the satisfied expression of someone whose plans were coming together perfectly. Margaret, dear, what do you think? Are you going to make my son wait another 29 years? Or are you going to put him out of his misery? I think, I said slowly, that I need some time to process everything that's happened this week. 3 days ago, I was married to Richard. Yesterday, I found out the man I'm staying with is my first love from college. Today, my husband showed up making threats, and my first love declared he's been in love with me for 3 decades. It's a lot. Of course it's a lot, David said, stepping back slightly to give me space. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I'm just asking you to stay, finish the work on Dad's papers. Let us get to know each other as the people we are now, not just the memories we've been carrying. And if we discover we're completely incompatible as adults, then we'll deal with that. But Margaret, what if we discover we're even more compatible now than we were at 21? Before I could answer that loaded question, Mrs. Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt again, she said, but Margaret, there's a phone call for you. A woman named Linda? She says it's urgent. My sister's name sent a chill through me. Linda never called unless something was wrong. I'll take it in the kitchen, I said, following Mrs. Morrison. Margaret, thank God. Linda's voice was tight with stress. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Richard called here looking for you and he was furious. He said some things. Margaret, I think you need to be careful. What kind of things? He said you were having an affair, that you'd been planning this for months, that you were trying to steal half his assets. He also said he was going to make sure you didn't get a penny in the divorce. I closed my eyes. Richard was already building his narrative, painting me as the villain so he could justify his own behavior. Linda, that's not what happened. Richard's been having an affair with his secretary for 6 months. I found them together Tuesday night. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. But Margaret, there's something else. Richard hired a private investigator. He's trying to build a case that you're having an affair with this David person. We're not having an affair. I know that. But Richard doesn't care about the truth. He cares about winning. And Margaret, he knows about David, about your relationship in college. My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about that? I don't know, but he does. He mentioned it specifically, said you'd been carrying on with an old boyfriend, that this was all planned, that you probably never got over your first love. I thought about Richard's expression when David had defended me, the way his anger had shifted to something that looked like genuine shock. He'd realized that what David and I had was real, and now he was going to use it against me. Margaret, you need a lawyer, a good one, and you need to be careful about appearances until the divorce is final. After I hung up with Linda, I stood in the kitchen trying to process this new complication. Richard was going to try to paint my relationship with David as an affair, even though we'd literally just kissed for the first time in 29 years. He was going to use our history against us, make it look like I'd been unfaithful. Everything all right? David asked from the doorway. Richard hired a private investigator. He's building a case that we're having an affair. David's expression darkened. Based on what evidence? You've been here for 3 days, and we haven't done anything inappropriate. Based on our history in college. Somehow he found out about that. I laughed bitterly. He's going to claim I never got over my first love, that this whole situation is proof I've been unfaithful to our marriage. That's ridiculous. You were completely faithful to your marriage. The fact that we happened to find each other again doesn't change that. It doesn't matter what's actually true. It matters what looks plausible to a judge. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table. David, I think I need to leave. Go stay with Linda, or get a hotel, something. I can't afford to give Richard ammunition for the divorce proceedings. You're not going anywhere, David said firmly, sitting down across from me. This is my house, you're my guest, and you haven't done anything wrong. I'm not letting Richard's threats chase you away. It's not just about being right, it's about being smart. If I stay here and continue developing feelings for you, Richard will use that to argue that I was emotionally unfaithful during our marriage. Then we'll fight him. I'll hire you the best divorce attorney in the state. I'll testify about the timeline of events, about the fact that you've done nothing inappropriate. David, you can't solve this with money. Watch me. There was something in his tone that reminded me this wasn't just the sweet college boy I'd fallen in love with 29 years ago. This was a successful businessman who was used to solving problems and protecting what mattered to him. I appreciate the offer, but I need to handle this myself. Why? Why do you always have to handle everything alone? The question caught me off guard. Because that's what adults do? They handle their own problems. That's what isolated adults do. Adults in relationships handle problems together. We're not in a relationship, aren't we? David leaned forward, his expression intense. Margaret, I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you for 29 years, and finding you again feels like the best thing that's ever happened to me. If that's not the beginning of a relationship, then I don't know what is. David, you can't be in love with me. You don't even know who I am anymore. I know you're brave enough to walk away from a bad marriage. I know you're kind enough to help a confused stranger. I know you're smart enough to see the historical value in my father's work. I know you make me laugh, challenge my assumptions, and make me want to be better than I've been. That's not enough to base a relationship on. It's more than most people have. David reached across the table and took my hands. Margaret, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to give us a chance. Stay here, let me help you fight Richard, and let's see what we could build together. Before I could answer, Eleanor appeared in the doorway carrying a tea service. I thought you might want some refreshments while you work out the details, she said, setting the tray on the table with satisfaction. Also, I called James Patterson. He's the best divorce attorney in the state. He'll be here at 2 o'clock. Mother, you can't just hire Margaret a lawyer without asking her. Of course I can. That's what family does. They help each other fight battles that are too big to handle alone. Eleanor looked at me seriously. Margaret, dear, you saved my life Tuesday night. Maybe not literally, but you saved me from being lost and frightened and alone. Now let us save you from being destroyed by a man who doesn't deserve the ground you walk on. I looked at these two people who'd known me for 3 days, but were offering to stand between me and Richard's attempts to destroy me financially. Then I thought about Linda's warning, about Richard's threats, about the long legal battle that lay ahead. I can't afford a high-powered attorney, I said quietly. You don't have to, David said. This is my gift to you. No strings attached, no expectations, just someone who cares about you, making sure you're protected. I can't accept that kind of help. Why not? Because it makes me dependent on you. Because it creates an imbalance in whatever relationship we might have. Because I don't want to be the woman who needs rescuing. David was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if it's not about rescuing? What if it's about partnership? You helped my mother when she needed help. Now we're helping you when you need help. Someday, maybe we'll need your help with something. That's how relationships work. People take care of each other. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Harold always said that love isn't keeping score. It's doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done, without worrying about who owes what to whom. I thought about Richard's threats, about the private investigator, about the battle that was coming whether I wanted it or not. I thought about facing that alone versus facing it with people who cared about the outcome. All right, I said finally. I'll meet with the attorney. But David, if we're going to do this, we need some ground rules. Such as? We keep our personal relationship separate from the legal issues. I don't want Richard to be able to claim that I'm only with you for your money or your legal help. Agreed. And we take things slowly. No declarations of love, no grand romantic gestures, no wedding planning. I looked pointedly at Eleanor. Until after the divorce is final. That seems reasonable, David said, though he looked disappointed. And if at any point this becomes too complicated, or too public, or too messy, I reserve the right to leave. Where would you go? I don't know, but I need to know I have that option. David nodded reluctantly. Agreed. But Margaret? Yes? I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you never want to use that option. 3 hours later, I was sitting in Eleanor's elegant living room with James Patterson, who looked like he'd stepped out of a movie about powerful attorneys. Expensive suit, silver hair, the kind of confidence that comes from winning battles for very wealthy clients. Mrs. Thompson, he said after reviewing the information I'd provided, your husband is making a serious mistake. Adultery cases are notoriously difficult to prove, especially when the alleged affair began after the marriage was already over in all but name. But we do have history, I said. David and I dated in college, 29 years ago, ancient history legally speaking. The fact that you reconnected by chance and developed feelings doesn't constitute adultery, especially when you can document that your husband was already having an affair. So you think we can fight this? I think we can destroy this. Your husband has been conducting a documented affair for 6 months. You have a clear timeline of when you discovered the affair and when you left the marriage. The fact that you then reconnected with an old friend who happened to be unmarried and available is not grounds for anything except perhaps a charge of good timing. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe freely. There is one thing, Patterson continued. Your husband's assets are substantial. This could be a lengthy and expensive fight, which is why I'm paying Mrs. Thompson's legal fees, David said from the doorway. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. David, I started, but he held up his hand. Partnership, remember? You let me help you with this, and someday when I need help with something, you can return the favor. What could you possibly need help with that I could provide? David looked at Eleanor, who was beaming like she'd won the lottery, then back at me. Learning how to be happy, he said simply. I've forgotten how to do that. But watching you this week, seeing you stand up for yourself, start over, choose courage over comfort, you're reminding me what happiness looks like. 6 weeks later, I was standing in Harold's study, which now looked like an actual organized archive instead of a paper explosion, when David appeared with 2 cups of coffee and the morning mail. Letter from your attorney, he said, handing me an official-looking envelope. I opened it with hands that barely trembled. The divorce had been finalized yesterday with a settlement that left me financially secure for the rest of my life. Richard had eventually agreed to a fair split of assets rather than face the embarrassment of having his 6-month affair detailed in court documents. It's done, I said, setting the letter aside. How do you feel? Free, relieved, ready to start the next chapter of my life. Any idea what that next chapter might include? I looked around the study that had become our shared workspace, at the organized boxes of Harold's life work, at the man who'd spent the last 6 weeks proving that some people are worth waiting 29 years for. I was thinking about applying to graduate school, I said, maybe pursuing that archaeology degree I always wanted. That sounds perfect. And maybe staying in this area, if someone could recommend a good place to live. David set down his coffee and moved closer. I might know a place. Large house, too much space for one person, beautiful gardens, excellent research library. Sounds expensive. The owner might be willing to work out some kind of arrangement, especially if the tenant was someone he was madly in love with. That could get complicated. What if the tenant was also madly in love with the owner? Then I'd say they should stop wasting time and get married. I laughed. David Hawthorne, are you proposing to me in your father's study? Actually, David said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket, I'm proposing to you in our study, because that's what this is now, ours. Everything I have, everything I am, I want to share with you. The ring inside the box wasn't the one from his desk drawer. It was something new, something chosen specifically for me. But as David slipped it onto my finger, I remembered Eleanor's words about the good china waiting for when I was ready. Yes, I said, before he could even ask the question properly. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll help you remember how to be happy. When Eleanor found us kissing in the study an hour later, she just smiled and went to call Mrs. Morrison about getting out the good china. It's about time, she said as she headed for the door. Harold always said the best love stories are the ones where people have to fight for their happy ending. As I looked around the room that contained Harold's life work, documents about ordinary people who'd lived through extraordinary times, who'd loved and lost and found each other again, I realized that maybe the most extraordinary stories were the ones where love was strong enough to survive time and separation and all the ways life tries to keep people apart. 29 years after David Harrison broke my heart, David Hawthorne was putting it back together. And this time, I was smart enough to know that some second chances are worth waiting for. Outside the study window, snow was falling again, covering the garden in pristine white. It looked like a new beginning. It looked like forever. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.